There are two major figures in British Surrealism. The first must be Roland Penrose. In his early 20s he moved to France and there met most of the major artists. Initially he came under the influence of Picasso and Braque, but from about 1925 he came into the circles around Breton. Arising from his close friendship with Picasso, in 1950 he wrote a sympathetic biography, Picasso, His Life and Work, followed by books on Miro, Man Ray and Tapier for Thames and Hudson. In the 1940s he became a gallery owner and collector, and also an art organiser. Indeed, he founded the Institute for Contemporary Arts, the ICA, in 1946. Early in the 1930s, Penrose became driven to promote Surrealism in Britain. He organised the first international Surrealist exhibition at the New Burlington Galleries in London in June 1936. As this was such a key event in Surrealism in Britain, we will look at this before turning to examine Penrose's own paintings. It was attended by André Breton, Paul Eluard and Salvador Dalí. It included works by many of the emerging continental Surrealists, Victor Brauner, De Chirico, Dalí, Oscar Dominguez, Max Ernst, Magritte, Wolfgang Paulin, Yves Tanguy, and many others. Dalí exhibited his painting The Dream of 1931, and Brauner showed his painting Cabaline in Motion. Salvador Dalí attended the event to give a lecture on his paranoid critical method. He decided to wear a diving suit to indicate that he was diving deeply into the unconscious, but had to shout so loud within the suit that he nearly suffocated and had to be rescued and released from the helmet. This exhibition inspired a generation of British artists to turn to Surrealism, and many works were produced during the late 30s and early 40s. We will now look at some of these artists and their work. First, let us consider Penrose's own paintings. Possibly one of his earliest Surrealist pieces was Night and Day. It is not too difficult to read. The figure is divided vertically with solid legs, but with the upper torso as a sky with clouds. She holds the black bird of night in her left and releases the white bird of day from her right. That same year he produced The Invisible Island, also called Seeing is Believing. Just who is doing the seeing is not clear. The woman whose head descends from the heavens and observes the world upside down, or the observer of this strange phenomenon who holds up his hand in the foreground. Penrose was rather taken with this image of the inverted woman, and in 1939 he created Octavia. Here the inverted woman with long hair appears again. This time her hands reach to the ground. Her body is cut off in the upper chest, and we see that she is actually built of bricks. Her hair is anchored to the ground by strong chains to give this strange building woman the form and stability to stop it falling over. Penrose suggests this instability through a diagonal line cutting across the image. This inverted woman image was in fact first explored by Penrose in a sculpture of 1937, The Dew Machine, included in the Surrealist Objects and Poems exhibition at the London Gallery in November 1937. In this, he inverted a mannequin's head within a frame. In the neck of the head we see various chemical apparatus, thistle and standard conical funnels, and other bits of glass tubing. Presumably the idea was that water or perhaps more metaphorically, spirit, placed in these funnels, would trickle down through the brain of the mannequin and emerge through the hair as inspiring dew. We see that the diagonal line that appears in Octavia is here shown as a rod held up by strings. An image that appealed to the artist is reused through a series of later works. Penrose had only a small output of paintings. In time he gave his considerable energies to art administration and the promotion of Surrealism, as well as gathering a considerable collection of artworks, which is now in the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh. He made a number of collages and some surreal objects. Here is one of his important paintings, The Conquest of the Air from 1938. It communicates directly, without needing any elaborate explanation, making the point that humans only develop flight through understanding this with their minds, by using the surrealist device of the bird caged inside the brain. The other major strong character in British Surrealism was Conroy Maddox. In the early 1930s, Maddox had discovered Surrealism, and by 1935, together with John Melville, he set up the Birmingham group of Surrealist artists. They were not happy with the London-based International Surrealist exhibition in 1936 and did not take part. The Birmingham group continued to work independently of the London-based Surrealists until the mid-1950s. We will look at the work of other members of this group after surveying Maddox's own extensive output. This early piece is his The Lesson of 1938. He was also drawn to abstract forms, as exemplified by his painting of 1939, Rendezvous, and he often liked to create collages. One of his best-known such collages from this period is his The Strange Country, made in 1940. In the mid-1940s, he produced a number of significant figurative surrealist paintings. The Stillness of the Day, with its diherical style interior and the rather wonderful device of depicting a trompe l'oeil but out-of-scale fly at the bottom left. Morning Encounter shows a young girl puzzling over some strange devices and objects, appearing like some factory or other such installation of machinery. These two pieces, created during the Second World War, seem entirely detached from external events. But Rue de Seine, entitled The House of Georges Hunet, appears to reference the war. Hunet was a surrealist painter in Paris who during the war became an active member of the French resistance. We see through the windows of the house various tableaux that could suggest the disruption of a search of the artist's house by the authorities. The 1950s and 60s saw his illusionist and reclining figure, which demonstrates Maddox's other more abstract style of working. His 1970 painting, Passage de l'Opéra, incorporates the bowler-hatted men, which René Magritte loved to use as elements in his work. This painting was apparently inspired by a novel by the surrealist writer Louis Aragon. Maddox later wrote, Aragon points out that his wanderings around the Passage de l'Opéra were without purpose, yet he waited for something to happen, something strange or abnormal, so as to permit him a glimpse of a new order of things. We see here the bowler-hatted men, which by then were a key element of René Magritte's work. The Passage de l'Opéra was also a notorious pick-up point for Parisian prostitutes. Maddox enjoyed using the device of an interior with a distant view across a deserted plain, in which some strange possibility seems to be presented to the figure in the foreground. Thus, the sanctuary shows an older man in his strange house, complete with steam engine, but with a half-clothed woman looking in from the outside. The astronomer has a Jodrell Bank-style radio telescope in the plain opening behind his house, while the late sleeper seems to be about to be awakened by the intrusion of a steam engine into the background space. Maddox continued working for over 60 years until he died in 2005. He kept faithful to Surrealism, while many other artists merely adopted the style for a few years before moving on. John Melville is mostly known for his abstract style, but he did produce a number of interesting Surrealist works in the 1930s and 40s. His 1937 painting, Museum of Natural History of the Child, captures a young boy's enthusiasm for all the things in nature, plants and insects that he has collected and brought into his room. He stands on the threshold of adolescence, as is shown by the appearance in the background of a woman plant seated on a chair who is undressing and showing her legs. His mushroom-headed child, of a year or so later, seems to follow up on this theme. His later works, however, draw him more towards abstract forms, as in his Landscape of Hope of 1947. Amy Bridgewater had visited the London Surrealist exhibition in 1936 and felt inspired to paint in that style. Her first major piece must be The Remote Cause of Infinite Strife of 1940. Across a rolling landscape of interlocking hills, a strange rope or thread comes from the far horizon and wraps around these, like a chain of causality. In the foreground we see it unravelling into its individual strands. Brave Morning, from 2 years later, shows a young woman opening the curtains and having to deal with a mass of things that crowd in upon her. The Fountain of 1945 shows a river meandering across a wide plain. In the foreground it opens out into a pool, which then cascades over a crevasse as a waterfall. In the pool, the head of a strange androgynous figure emerges and gazes at the viewer. From its back appear wings or some strange tail. Desmond Morris is well known in the UK for his television appearances as a zoologist and naturalist. He became a media personality primarily through his seminal book, The Naked Ape of 1967, which especially contextualized man as a primate and explored that part of our nature. He had, however, been painting since meeting Maddox in the 1940s. His style, which did not significantly change or evolve over the years, used flowing abstract organic shapes, which often incorporated figurative elements. Here is Celebration from 1948. The obvious influences on his style are Miro and Tanguy, rather than Dali and Ernst. His Arena of 1976 still shows him working with the same sorts of forms he used in the 1948 painting. He often adopted themes which relate to his zoological interest, thus The Killing Game of 1960 and Disturbance in the Colony of 1973. The Red Guard seems to be set in a Surrealist chicken coop. In 1935, Rubin Mednikov then a young commercial artist who had studied at St Martin's School of Art, and the older Grace Palethorpe, a successful Freudian analyst, especially working with criminals and delinquents, met at a party given by Victor Neuberg, the follower of the notorious Aleister Crowley. She was setting up a research project which was supposed to investigate the underlying causes of criminal behaviour. The two soon got together to explore through art the nature of the unconscious. They would create some painting or drawing, then exhaustively explore together through a kind of cross-analysis the interior origin of these images. These sessions were written down for later study. They soon fell in with the Surrealists and were exhibited at the 1936 exhibition. Boeton was especially impressed by their way of working, that he said they were the best and the most truly surrealist of all the works in the exhibition. This is one of Palethorpe's drawings, Ancestors 1, from the exhibition. Rubin Mednikov had his remarkable Stairway to Paradise painting and some others included in the exhibition. Their plan was to develop a Palethorpe-Mednikov psychoanalytical theory, which they hoped would provide the basis for new therapies using art and imagery. Sadly, they did not break through to any significant conclusions, but pursued this method for over 30 years of intensive investigation and analysis. They produced some fascinating pieces. Thus, Mednikov created his Flying Pig in 1936, with its complex layering of symbols, teacup, bell, a shoe, a yacht, and the pig itself composed of various animal components. His orgiastic Melody in 1937 reworked some of the same elements. Their psychoanalysis of art offended some of the other British Surrealists, and they were expelled from the group in 1940. Later, Palethorpe became a consultant at the Portman Clinic, and he set up the world's first art therapy school in Dorking, and later moved to Hastings, where they both died in 1971. Sadly, their work is almost unknown nowadays. In 1937, Palethorpe produced probably her best known, though most uncharacteristic painting. Being untitled, this doesn't give us any clue as to what she intended, but it seems to have a large being on the right, to which some small child beings are seeking shelter and protection. They bear egg-shaped forms. The muted colours are unusual for her output. Most of her paintings are bright and cheerful, as in Salempix of 1936, which brings together a multiplicity of symbols. Again, the cup, lion, egg-like forms, a string of beads or perhaps a tail, all within a matrix of almost abstract shapes. Her Blazing Infant of a few years later is in much the same style, and though evocative and puzzling, it seems to have almost a humorous content. Mednikov's work is also not particularly disturbing or unsettling. Here is his Little Black Boys Don't Tell Lies and The King of the Castle. Next, we will look at the work of two major British artists, Ethel Kahun and John Armstrong, then some more minor figures, before finishing with a short glance at some artists whose contribution to Surrealism was perhaps less significant. Ethel Kahun attended the Slade School of Art in London. Initially she worked in a classical style, as in her Song of Songs from 1933. After seeing the London exhibition of 1936, she began to introduce Surrealist elements into her work, as in Scylla of 1938. Scylla, of course, refers to the classical legend of the two rocks, Scylla and Charybdis, which threaten sailors. Kahun said it arose from what she could see of herself while in the bath. Later, she travelled to France, where she met up with Breton and some of the Surrealists. She was deeply immersed in esoteric, particularly the magic of the Golden Dawn and the OTO. Later in life, she wrote extensively on magic and the occult, as well as penning a Surrealist novel, The Goose of Hermogenes, and a number of non-fiction books. Here is a painting in which she seems to show the chakras, or esoteric energy points, in the human body. In 1940, her interest in occultism partly led to her being expelled from the London Surrealist group. However, this did not affect her work, as we see in The Pine Family of 1941. Here, 3 torsos with different skin colours are shown mutilated by castration. There is, of course, a play on the French word pine, penis, and she playfully misleads by depicting on the bodies the leaves of some families of pine trees. One bears the label quelque bois, a little lame, perhaps an understatement. Another has the label the circumcised hermaphrodite, while the topmost figure is labelled Attis, the Greek god who castrated himself. Kahun used the phrase psychological morphology, first coined by Roberto Matta, to describe her paintings of the 1940s. Matta was trying to paint what he called the inscape, a sort of landscape of the interior mind. For Ethel Kahun, this inner landscape was full of flowing organic forms, thus her 1944 painting, A Visitation, and Guardian Angel of 1946. In these 2 paintings, we see the use of Surrealist automatism techniques, where she let the paint flow without her control from one area into another, perhaps by tilting the canvas. She used this method in 1977 to create her set of tarot cards, where she poured enamel paint onto a horizontal sheet of paper and allowed it to flow and mix, sometimes intervening by moving the paint around with the pointed handle of a brush. We will look at her work again in a future lesson on Surrealists and the occult. John Armstrong was a painter, a designer of film and stage sets. He painted murals and also undertook book illustrations. He begins in the early 20s, painting abstract forms, but in 1930 he created what must surely be one of the earliest Surrealist works by a British artist, his Open Door. This appears almost in De Chirico style with strong dark shadows. The wall above the door is painted to mimic the clouds. In the late 30s, he produced a series of Surrealist pieces, including The Dreaming Head of 1938 and Heaviness of Sleep of the same year. In 1941, he made a painting which he entitled Icarus, and he reworked this image many times in later years. Here is a version from 1961 and another from 1967. In 1939, being unable through ill health to take part in the war effort, Leslie Hurry isolated himself in his secluded cottage at Thaxted, Essex, and began to paint and create intricate automatic drawings. Among his first Surrealist works must surely be his portrait of Grace Sholto Douglas of 1940. The scene on the left, behind the sitter's head, must be his imaginary portrayal of some dream in the sitter's mind. In an ancient cathedral, a king with a golden crown, wearing a golden robe, seems to be crowning a naked woman with a silver crown, while a female soul bird in a circular aura flies over their heads. This bird form appears a year later in his painting Imaginary Figure, but here double-headed and within a rainbow aura. His Conflict of 1945 would appear to have a complex interpersonal narrative. It is not clear as to whether the conflict is between the man and the woman, or is within the man himself, as around his head two other faces emerge, one appearing somewhat menacing. The gesturing female figures in the background appear to be offering advice as to how to solve the conflict. It seems likely this painting arose from some deeply felt experience of the painter, which we do not have access to. The Follies of 1945 is a similar work with multiple figures struggling together in some way within a room. The male figure on the left would appear to be Hurry himself. He was often ill, and thus the skeleton figure on the right may also be Hurry depicting the mortal side of himself. Another minor figure in British Surrealism was Edith Remington. Her painting career was sadly short-lived, but during a decade or so she produced some wonderfully challenging Surrealist paintings. Remington studied at Brighton School of Art, and in 1937 she moved from Manchester to London and was accepted enthusiastically into the circles of the London Surrealist group. Her 8 Interpreters of the Dream, painted in 1940, seems to draw on Dali's staged event in a diving suit at the 1936 exhibition. For here she depicts 8 diving suits propped up on sticks to dry out in the colonnade of some classical villa. They are lacking their helmets, but instead these are provided by 8 sheep's heads which lie on the lawn beside them. She seems to have been quite taken with this diving suit image, and in 1947 painted the Oneiroscopists. Oneiroscopy means the interpretation of dreams, and here she shows someone surrealistically equipped to dive deeply into the meaning of dreams. The figure in the suit has a bird's skull, which it seems unlikely would have fitted the spherical helmet. Her polymorphic interior is more difficult to read. Here, a human figure is trapped under a triangular table by her head, transformed into a screaming skull, which is thrust through the table and appears on a plate like a joint of meat to eat. In the foreground, a fish walks with the aid of 2 feet. Various sets of spare feet are shown on shelves and in a little cupboard. This is the kind of surrealistic work that continually fascinates because the content is so enigmatic that it resists a narrative interpretation. Museum of 1951 depicts a sculptural head displayed within a glass vase. Like most classical sculptures, the eyes are carved as smooth blank surfaces. The head, however, is covered with eyes, probably the remnants of all the people who have gazed upon this object in the museum. Tony del Renzio was the son of an Italian aristocrat attached to the Russian court. His mother was a Romanov and the great-granddaughter of Tsar Nicholas I. In 1938 he came to Britain and became drawn to the Surrealist group, and in time met with Ethel Kahun. They married in 1943, but the marriage only lasted until 1947. In 1940 he created a Surrealist ballet, Midas, with the music by Elizabeth Lutyens, at the Lyric Hammersmith, which ran for 100 performances. In 1941, he created a couple of significant surrealist paintings. The Paranoid Regression shows a head with the face removed to show the interior of the brain. In this we see a scene on a desert plain on which two figures stand discoursing on the circumference of a small circle. This scene is repeated some distance away. Higher up in the interior space of the skull is a glass sphere or convex mirror in which we see a figure again standing on a plane, repeated over and over in an infinite regression. Here, Del Renzio was probably attempting to produce an image for Dali's paranoid critical method. The other work was his Rendezvous of Manners, but this is more enigmatic and impenetrable. Other British artists who are often considered as surrealists are Gordon Onslow Ford and John Banting. Though Onslow Ford was part of the movement and had met many of the key figures in Paris, his work is more drawn to abstraction. His painting Propaganda of 1940 is typical of his early style, but later it became uncompromisingly abstract in Present and Company, 1969. John Banting produced some interesting surrealist pieces in the 1940s, including Janus, or The Eye of the World, and The Funeral. To conclude, we should just look at a part-time Scottish painter whose work was only recently discovered by his family. Edwin Lucas, born in 1911 and died in 1990, produced numerous surrealist-style paintings from about 1939. These he seems to have kept himself, and he was unknown to the wider art world. Here is his Diagnosis of 1939, quite abstract in style, but with the Schism of 1940 and Upstairs Landing, he interwove various forms that fractured the narratives of the individual components in a surreal way. His Human Situation of 1941 depicts various humans and their activities taking place on disjoint separate rectangular planes. Surrealism in Britain began with Roland Penrose's envisaging of the Surrealist exhibition of 1936. This inspired a generation of artists, some of whom, Conrad Maddox and Ethel Kahun especially, created truly surrealistic works for the remainder of their long lives. Others, such as Edith Remington, Amy Bridgewater and Leslie Hurry, had a brief creative period, but produced some outstanding pieces. In the next presentation, we will look at the various artists in 1930s and 40s America who took up Surrealism and reworked it in an American way.